I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right, first item on the agenda is public comments. Does anybody wish to make a comment? Mr. Drager?
Supervisor Marshall here.
Hello, this is Irvin Fick.
Thanks, Gail. We got you. Okay, Mr. Fick.
I'm sorry,
Mr.
is this
Fick?
a Marathon County Board meeting?
Yes.
I
Finance?
believe so. That's what I was logged into for the property. I was told to call in for this number. You're doing the property at 425 Super.
Yes, sir. We can hear you. Go ahead.
Yes, I was trying to participate in the meeting as well.
We've got you marked as present, Gail. Thank you. Okay, can you hear us now?
Yes, I can hear you now, Kim.
Okay, thanks, Gail. Mr. Fick, you can go ahead.
All right.
Did you wish to make a public comment?
I did.
Okay.
I didn't know. I guess we were kind of listening to the things together. I'm on the phone thing and we have your video going at the same time.
Okay, you can go ahead and make your public comment. We can hear you.
Okay, good. Well, I just wanted to address the board and bring in who I am. This is Irvin Fick. We're proposing to purchase, we did a sealed bid at the property on Super Street, the home and the building attached to it, and just wanted to make sure that we went through on who we are. Irvin Fick is part of Fick Bricks, and we own numerous properties in Lincoln County. And we are known, and I have a letter of recommendation from the city, from the mayor of Merrill, that I can send in if you'd like me to do that as well. But what we do is we go in and rehab properties, turn them over and turn them into generally rentals. This one, my wife and I looked at yesterday. We're very interested in. We think that the home can be brought back up to a very good standard again and rehab nicely. First thing we do is go and clean up the outside, put a new roof on it, repair and replace all the siding, redo the building, the building there. We would like to use the home as a rental home and our taxis. We own Blue Jay Taxi up here. We would like to be able to store those as a kickoff point. We would certainly put the money in to rehab it and make it a valuable piece of property into the community again. And we would like you to consider our bid when you open them later, if that's, and hopefully we are lucky enough to be the high bidder and the chosen bidder. I thank you for taking your time for listening.
Thank you. Any other public comments? Any other public comments? If not, we're going to move item 5A to later in the agenda, just for agenda repair. And we will be, after we deal with the minutes, we will be taking up item 6B3 and then 6B2, followed by 6B2.
Just called, and I'm guessing they're one of these people as well. It's up to you if you want to. Okay.
And we'll deal with the, maybe we'll deal with the bid opening first, and then we'll deal with those other two items, if that's all right. Without objection? Okay, what are your wishes relative to the June 20th meeting?
Move to approve, Mr. Chairman.
Been moved to approve the minutes. Is there a second? Second by Supervisor Leahy, moved by Chair Gibbs. Any discussion? If not, all is in favor of approval of the minutes will signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no.
Aye.
That motion carries. Then we'll jump down to item 6A2, the bid opening for tax deed parcel 2023-1 425 Super Street in Mosinee. We have three.
I have 3 bids that I have received, and I will open them in the order in which they were received. The first bid is in the amount of $8,500, and that includes a check for the full amount. I'm sorry, the bid is for $85,000. The bid is, the check is for $8,500, which is 10%. Do you want to know the name?
Yes.
This is from David Nelson and Joe Drager. The second bid that we received is for $137,500. And that is enclosed, accompanied by a check for $13,750, which is 10%, and that is from Irvin Fick. And the third bid I received is from Jeff Ragusi in the amount of $80,220, and it is accompanied by the 10% down payment as well.
All right. Are there any questions from the committee members? If not, what are your wishes? Chair Gibbs.
Make a motion to award the bid to Mr. Frick for the $137,500 purchase price of the 425 Super Street in Mosinee.
Is there a second? Seconded by Supervisor Leahy. Any discussion? If not, all those in favor of approval of the sale of the property to Irvin Frick for $137,500 will signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed, no. That motion carries unanimously. Thank you. All right, we will then jump down to item 6B3, and we'll call on the illustrious sheriff.
Thank you. Thank you for having us here. We're here to talk a little bit about the soon-to-be village of Rib Mountain. As you know, yesterday they had a vote, and what I've read in the media is that it was a pretty overwhelming vote that they're going to take on the village status. What that's going to require in the future for Rib Mountain is that they're either going to have to A, form their own police department, or they could contract with services from another police department or the sheriff's office. We have had a long-standing relationship with Rib Mountain for many years, providing services for them. It initially had started with us working in the school zones, where they would contract for a deputy for certain periods of time, and then they contracted us for part-time patrol, and then ultimately in 2020, I believe it was, they contracted a full-time deputy in the town. And when they did that, they pay all the costs of the deputy, and they purchase the vehicle as part of that program. We're here before you now, even before they knew that they were going to officially have their village status. They had approached us and asked that we expand from the one deputy to a second deputy that they were willing to pay for. So we've been working with the town and have come to an agreement. And what they're going to do is they're willing to pay us. Your numbers in your packet can be a little deceiving, but the amount is right around $114,663, which will pay all the wages and benefits for the deputy with a little bit of a buffer, and the agreement that as our deputy contract increases, this contract will increase over the course of the 5 years. The remaining $50,000 is money that they've given to us to purchase their vehicle, all of the equipment for the vehicle, the striping of the vehicle going forward. We have included here a levy portion on behalf of Marathon County, and that's the really deceiving part, because the reality is that $5,000 is equipment that we bring into this, things that we already have at the sheriff's office. We're not asking for any new money, but this is things like the handgun that the deputy will be issued. If there is a rifle in the squad, that equipment. Computers for the squads, because those computers have software on them that require us to be in compliance with federal laws and state laws on, and those would have to come back. So anything that we bring into this contract that if we were to sever the contract, we would expect to bring back to Marathon County, those are those items. But again, this is not new money that we're asking for. So our request is that the committee move forward to the board a recommendation that we enter into this agreement with Rib Mountain and we expand from 1 deputy to 2 deputies in the town.
And this was reviewed and approved by Public Safety yesterday?
That's correct.
Any questions? Chair Gibbs.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Sheriff, the one question I would, so if we had a incident outside of Rib Mountain area, would we be able to utilize that deputy for a major incident in the county? And so if that's the case, well.
Yes. The short answer to that is yes, but it goes beyond that. Many of these deputies that we have working there are also on our special teams. They might be assigned to the SWAT team or the dive team or to our crisis negotiation teams. And Rib Mountain understands that there will be times when we pull that deputy and they will be responsible for other duties. And we understand there's this give and take that's going to take place, and that has worked for 2 years and has not been a problem. We have good communication with the administrator, with Galen, and we've been meeting with town officials on a regular basis. We update them on what's happening, and I think because of that good communication, those have not been concerns of theirs that they've raised with us, and we've been able to work through those.
Okay, thank you very much. I think it's a perfect advantage for the county also.
Absolutely.
Other questions, comments? If not, a motion would be in order. What are your wishes? Gail?
Supervisor Marshall, I have a question.
Go ahead.
Is it based on their population and the amount of activity? Are 2 deputies typically enough to cover like a 24-hour period of time, 7 days a week? Or, I'm thinking of a comparable size village. If they would have their own force, how many deputies would they need?
The short answer is yes, it's been working. When they take on that village status, we will have to begin the conversation of what additional resources look like. Yesterday, as an example, Chief Deputy Millhausen spent some time looking through data. With our records management system, we're able to use heat maps in order to tell us the day of the week and the time of the day that are busiest. And then based upon that data, that's how we assign staff to Rib Mountain. With 2 deputies right now under this contract, we will be able to cover those peak times when they have calls for service. If we start to see that increase, and I'll be real frank, we've already had initial conversations with Rib Mountain about expanding to 3 deputies. So that is not going to be a surprise to anyone. They already know that those conversations are taking place. But I think that when we get to 3, that's where we need to take a pause before we go and just put resources someplace when there aren't calls for service that are needed. Another example would be that when there is not full-time coverage in Mosinee has been, from time to time, they had people that were ill or people that were out on injury. We would come in and assist them after hours if they needed help. So they're probably the closest comparable. But the answer is right now I think we'll be fine with 2 to 3, but I do see this expanding in the future.
Thank you.
So could you have that discussion in public? Yes.
My question, Mr. Chair, was whether should Rib Mountain become a village, whether they would have the statutory obligation to have 24/7 coverage through their department or through contract.
And I would have to look at the statute again. I remember we met with Corp Counsel here 3 months ago. I think it was in April we met, in order to look at that. And there is a population requirement that requires at a certain threshold, and I don't remember that number, that they have 24/7 coverage. What that looks like is however we would assign. So if we were working with them and we said, we think that we can cover it with additional resources from the sheriff's office that are already working, that's coverage. They're going to get that. We would just have to work through that with them when that time comes. But it doesn't mean that we have to put a dedicated deputy in the village just to sit there. It means that we could augment that with the resources that we have and then work through a reimbursement structure or some other sort of give and take with them with how we manage the resources in the village.
So associated with that increase risk is the potential for additional management oversight. Would we try to recoup those costs at that time? Because there's training and other costs that we incur as an employer. Are we looking at recovering all of our costs, direct and indirect?
They are paying those.
They are.
So when we send one of these deputies to training, they're paying those wages. So that's included in there. As far as our management oversight of 2 or 3 people, it's minimal because so many of our systems are automated now. Everything auto-populates and systems flow. So right now we have not seen a need in order to say that there's all of these additional resources going into it. If it grew to 5 or 6 or 7, I think now we have to start talking about span of control and what other resources would be needed to support that.
So I have a question for Christy. Do we need to have a budget transfer to reflect both the expense and the revenue coming in? And if so, we will need to deal with that
Yep.
prior.
Yep, we can work on that. We work with Casey and Jenny really closely, so what would be is the expense, because you'll have the personnel services, you'll have the capital costs or operating costs, and then the outside revenue is going to be revenue from other local governments.
And if I can add one thing, Mr. Chair, the resolution before you is really driven by the ordinance you have relative to new position requests. That's section 4.20. So largely this is operational, like the sheriff referenced, and as Christie just alluded to, the expenses and the revenues are going to be a wash. Your section 4.20 lays out a process through which new positions are evaluated. It starts with a conversation between the department head and I, and we've had that conversation, and it centers around all the things you've said today. This is a strong agreement in terms of past practice. It is financially advantageous to the county, or certainly not detrimental. Second, it's operationally very beneficial, as alluded to by Supervisor Gibbs. And then moving that forward after that conversation has to go to the standing committee, which it did yesterday, to public safety. They approved it. It then comes to this committee and ultimately then goes to the full board. That is how new positions are created within Marathon County outside of the budget process, based on that ordinance. So that's what the resolution, that's how it's crafted. This is virtually identical in terms of process to that which was used in 2020, as the sheriff referenced, when the first Rib Mountain contract deputy was created.
So the effective date of this would be what?
August 1st.
Right, so in light of that, if it's approved, I would request that we have a budget transfer come in at our next meeting for consideration by the county board, and, with the offsetting revenue and expenses, but I think that would be appropriate.
Yeah, and they have the budget in there now, so I think August would be doable and work great for the budget transfer, because then we'll have more details on people and the things that you've agreed to with the new person. Yep.
Be great. Thank you, Christy.
So are we looking at that for the July county board meeting or the August? I would think we would need to have the position and the funding in place prior to the hiring, so we would need to take that up this month.
Our hiring is going to take some time. We can still assign a deputy there under the current staffing, but as far as our hiring process goes, we're going through a recruitment right now, so it'll take us some time anyhow.
And it's kind of a chicken and egg. So if you approve the position, then we can put her in the budget. So, yeah.
All right, any other questions? If not, what are your wishes? Chair Gibbs.
Make a motion to approve the expanded position, one sheriff's deputy, and recommend approval by the full, to the full board July meeting.
Is there a second? Seconded by Supervisor Lemmer. Any discussion? If not, all those in favor of the motion will signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed, no. That motion carries. Thank you. So we will look forward to receiving that budget transfer at a future date. All right, now we will deal with item 6B2, approval of the easement related to the water main construction, reconstruction, maintenance, inspection, and repair on the Marathon Park property. Jamie, you're on, so turn it over to you.
Hi, which I'm on two meetings at one time. Thank you. This is brought forward as we looped the water main through Marathon Park. The looping required an easement because if it's looped from the main water system, then Wausau Waterworks will take it on as their infrastructure and their maintenance for the main water main. We will still be responsible for the laterals, but in order to do that, the Water Works Commission required an easement through the park. This did go to City Council and to the Water Commission and was approved. So it's now coming to the county to allow them to have that easement to maintain that water main going forward. It is complete. It is in the park now, looped and working very well. So this is a granting so that they can do the maintenance on it.
Any questions? Chair Gibbs.
Jamie, now that it's looped, is that going to decrease the amount of cost that we incur as far as winterization for that line in that we used to have to do in the winter?
It should reduce some of the costs. We do not have to winterize that anymore. We still will have to winterize the laterals, but they are all actually to put to a depth of 7 feet or more. And then the laterals are all insulated, so we should have less breakage. They are all at a level where we should have a minimal maintenance throughout the whole system. And then with the water main itself, if there are any infrastructure issues with it, it will be the responsibility of the water department. So that will help reduce our time and cost as well. So we'll just have the laterals.
All right, any other questions? If not, what are your wishes? Supervisor Leahy. Move.
I would move to approve.
Okay, moved by Supervisor Leahy. Is there a second? Seconded by Supervisor Lemmer. Any discussion? If not, all those in favor will signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. That motion carries. All right, we will now
Thank you.
jump up to item 5A, review consideration of the 2024 budget and policy recommendations from the committee. And I think we can lump those three items. I had a conversation with Deputy Administrator in brief discussions with Administrator Leonard relative to next year's budget. And I think what we're looking for is, are there any changes that people would like to see us evaluate? The discussions that we had was relative to our energy policy, and we had advanced an energy task force looking at ways to potentially reduce our reliance on the utilities for energy. And in the past, we've had discussions about how we could reduce that, and are there some capital projects that we might be able to undertake using ARPA dollars that would have some long-term savings and other things. And I know that part of this overlaps with the KIP, the Capital Improvement Plan discussion, but I would just, my preference is if we can start adopting policies and implement practices that would reduce both our kilowatt and therm utilization and make us more energy efficient and therefore better global citizens, it would be great. So, Chris, I don't know if you have any comments that you'd like to offer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Is there a particular angle you'd like me to start with?
Wherever you'd like to.
Okay, well, I can tell you that we're currently looking at the energy policy the county has and updating that. There's some things that are outdated in there, but there's also some good reminders in the sense of things like thermostat control. We have regulation and codes we have to meet in terms of where they have to be for occupancy. So in some ways, your use is driven by the regulations by having an occupied building. That said, when we have buildings that are unoccupied, we make sure that those buildings are not on, for lack of a better term, and so that you're realizing some savings there. We have a small amount of funding for things like LEDs and shifting along those lines. Those are smaller pieces of the puzzle, but certainly there's more to work on in those areas if there was more funding available. I've been discussing, two things. I've been working very closely with our natural gas provider in terms of looking at where the markets are at, and then strategies in terms of how to purchase things so that you can try to provide some predictability and stability for budget purposes, which gets a little further away from the point I think you're making, but it still is a part of the conversation in terms of how do you have a budget number for something like natural gas purchasing that has insulated as much as you can from volatility while still not preventing you from capturing dips in the market, for instance. So there's tools for that. I'm also setting up a meeting with WPS to talk to them about our use overall and see if there's some strategies from their side in terms of how you can look at sort of peak use days that often drive some of the rates month to month. And then I can tell personally, when I pay these bills, I look at the month-to-month use and variations, and just as an example, I identified some areas that were sort of confusing to me, but were actually explained by the fact that we had metered the North Central or the Lakeview campus differently. So there's a lot of new meters, and so a lot of energy is flowing through there, unlike how it has been in the past. And so on the global approach to this, it's going to take some time to kind of analyze how those changes are. You won't be able to look at the past as much to understand how certain meters and use is going to be dictated in the future. But nevertheless, that's something that we're paying attention to. I will say that, the county's a big ship. There's lots of facilities, and I've only been here for a little over a year, but, I think there's kudos in line in a sense that the county has taken the appropriate steps in purchasing new and modernizing and making things more efficient when those opportunities arise. There's still big chunks of that out there, and that's what some of it is largely reflected in CIP and probably will be for at least a couple more years. But there have been very important steps that have helped gain whatever efficiencies you can through more modern equipment and through even things that are smarter, again, for lack of a better term, in how they operate. Let's see, I wrote some notes here. Also looking at, what vendors have out there in terms of doing a countywide efficiency assessment. Certainly we can do that as part of the facilities team, but we're also still in the middle of swinging out to take on more of the facilities across the county than we have historically. And so part of that too is being sensitive to staff capacity. And so there's some things we've been looking at in terms of recalibrating some of the positions in the department to have somebody like a facilities manager, for example, that would have their thumb on the pulse of everything, rather than things being a little more decentralized or as they have been historically. So I think that will help with those conversations too as you move forward. I think, the task force not having been created, there's still lots of questions, to your point, that are being begged right now. There are certainly some things that I think from a financial perspective that get wrapped up in political discussions and perspectives that I think still are worthy of looking into, because I think that technology is far enough along that there's plenty of proof in the pudding, if you will, in terms of what sort of benefits can be gained, even for things that are somewhat limited, like a PV array and solar arrays, that you're limited to net metering now, whereas some people still kind of perceive that you can sell energy back to the utility and make a lot of money that way. You can't do that right now. So, but nevertheless, that is something you could look at for new construction in terms of, if the morgue were to move forward, are there opportunities there? We could look at the Lakeview campus. It doesn't have to be new construction. You can look at, I think, if there was direction from the committee and the board to kind of say, what would it look like if? Then you could look at a high-use building like the courthouse and say, okay, here's what the use is at the courthouse. Here's what the sort of array for net metering would look like. And then explain sort of with sort of simple, straightforward math in a sense of when you net meter that out, you're insulating yourself from rate increases year to year, and you're able to have some, a degree of predictability in terms of, or resiliency if the power were to go out, things like that. So those conversations I think would be good to have, but also it would be good to have direction from you and the board to know that that conversation is one that we want to have. And again, I said it previously that my focus in all of this has been on the financial side of things, where I know that sometimes it gets wrapped up in political perspectives or just personal philosophies, which is fine and understandable. But I think that if we're to take the question about how do you try to mitigate pressures from utilities and things like that seriously, then we should put everything on the table and at least look at it, not just see what it can do and then go from there. If there's, we know that there's that grant from the Department of Energy still out there. It's not a huge sum of money, but it could be something we could leverage towards looking at the countywide efficiency piece. Those sorts of plans do cost money, so that could cover something like that or complement things that we do internally. I don't know if you can tell, but I do think about this a lot. But yeah, I'm certainly open to comments, suggestions, and other ideas. And I'm glad you brought it up, because I do think that it is still the right time to be looking into this, even if all you do is look at sort of rate increases and our general lack of control in this area. So doing things that can sort of mitigate that lack of control can certainly have a long-term benefit.
Any follow-up questions? I know Supervisor Lemmer, you've been very interested in this issue.
I am, and I'm trying to wrap my head around not really knowing what I can ask for and what I shouldn't ask for. I don't really know what my role is. I kind of assumed with the task force being voted down, the issue was kind of on staff and not part of our policy. So I'll be honest, I don't even know what kind of policy we could suggest.
Administrator Leonard.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'm asking not to comment on your comments. I don't have an answer for you, but I do think, just building on what Chris said, one of your chief policy decisions you're going to at least start talking about today, as was alluded to, is your capital improvement program for next year and the next several years. And you will see, there are some very clear projects that, if nothing else, will jump off the page to you as these are infrastructure investments relative to energy usage that, they're expensive, but you'll start to see the kind of long-term ROI, as Chris alluded to. So that is a policy, your annual budget and your capital improvement plan that you approve as part of it are the chief policy document you select each and every year. So where you put funding is certainly a policy decision. The second thing I'll say, just from an operational standpoint, as Chris alluded to, they're doing a lot of work at facilities. I wanted to give them, to use the word kudos also. We recently, we're government, we'll rip off and duplicate if someone else is doing something that is intelligent. Let's try that. So we recently reached out to the City of Wausau School District as well as the DC Everest School District, they have a great many buildings, each of them, and having a comprehensive strategy as to energy, an energy policy, and also how do you, purchasing gas. I mean, that was the big thing that got us through last year's budget, right, with the having to utilize some American Rescue Plan Act dollars to fill that gap. So learning what are good strategies, even if you do nothing else differently in terms of your infrastructure, can you buy differently? I mean, that is so there's kind of different levels of, you know, as we use the term low-hanging fruit, right? The low-hanging fruit is, hey, even if you do nothing differently in terms of infrastructure, is there a better way to buy? We're looking into that, just so you know. The next level up is, again, that how do we change our practices, as Chris said, looking at, you know, what are our buildings' usage? Can we identify, hey, we have these peak times, what's going on? Can we perhaps roll back, you know, turn the thermostat a little bit to identify where those opportunities are? And then the highest fruit, of course, are those infrastructure pieces that, as you're going to hear, we have a chiller project that is it's a large project, but you'll see why it pencils out in terms of ROI. That's kind of the stepped approach that staff are looking at. If you have suggestions or if you have other things you think we should evaluate, please let us know. But we wanted to make very clear, as the chair alluded to, this isn't something that, because the task force doesn't exist, we're not looking at. We recognize it's a significant portion of our budget on the facility side. Consolidating our footprint, though, is also a significant positive. So as we continue to do that, we will see improvement.
Supervisor Leahy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Also wondering if this would be an opportunity for any sort of intra-government cooperation policies in which we work together. I know that, like, the City of Wausau currently has a solar task force work group currently meeting. Just wondering if that could be an opportunity to join forces.
This guy's just an outstanding chair, too. Her husband chairs it. But I think that there are some opportunities to learn in, you know, as they go through that the issue of the new tax credits that are available that were never available for local government. There's opportunity to share knowledge on how those would be applicable. I have some questions, Chris, relative to, I know that one of the things you're trying to do is consolidate facilities management, and parks and highway and others have been on their own. Are there opportunities, have we fully utilized LED lighting and other more energy efficient lighting at our facilities, and are there opportunities, and are there opportunities through focus on energy, and have we done energy audits in our buildings?
Yeah, I think the short answer is whenever we do a project, we reach out to the focus on energy individuals. Like, we have a relation, I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but there's an individual we contact, like the Eastgate Hall boiler project, for instance. There was a focus on energy benefit there, so we harnessed that. But yeah, anytime we have something that may have, there might be an opportunity, we reach out and say, is there something here? So we're looking for those sorts of opportunities if they're out there, and taking advantage of them. But I think in terms of auditing, we can certainly try to get a little more focus, I guess, in terms of usage over time, and then like how that's beginning to change. Also, just kind of a global perspective in terms of what it has meant to take certain buildings offline, like Thomas Street and things like this. Is that what you were pointing to? Just to be sure I'm answering your question.
Yes. I think we would look for you to look for those opportunities, and as you develop both the budget for next year and the capital budget for next year, is if there are opportunities, and again, we've got that once-in-a-lifetime opportunity through the American Rescue Plan Act to do some of those capital investments that may, in the long term, realize both energy and cost savings to the county. I would really encourage you, and I don't know if the committee would like to sort of direct them to do that. or if that's through consensus, Supervisor Leahy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think part of the difficulty when we have these discussions is they often feel like isolated, one-off. We don't often come back to the same discussion points. So kind of alluding to what Supervisor Lemmer was talking about, and I know staff time is limited for, capturing data and explaining data, but it might be helpful within this committee and even something to present to the full board to have more of a broad overview of the changes that have been happening and what that means for cost savings and a more black and white picture perhaps. Because a lot of these projects, especially with the KIP, we're talking about them as large-scale projects that we approve, they happen, we don't talk about again. So maybe if we could kind of capture this ongoing effort and really try to show the board as a whole that an impact is being made.
Good suggestion. Chair Gibbs.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One of the things that strikes me, is that we should do a comprehensive energy efficiency analysis of all facilities, and then if there's recommendations that come from that, what the ROI is on those investments. And so that's something that I would be, looking for or hoping to gain from the global prospect of the county's footprint.
I'm seeing nods.
Yeah, I can certainly look into those things and bring them back. I just don't, it's not really a caveat, but I think the position the county's been in, as best I can tell anyway, I've only been facilities director for 6-7 months, but there a lot of things have been not addressed over time. So there's a tension between some of the things we're talking about. I mean, there's still efficiencies gained, but there's also some there's a backlog of like really core things that don't always dovetail neatly with the other side of the conversation. There are benefits, of course, and I'll touch on a few of those a little bit later, but just want to put that out there because sometimes even it's more of an immediate thing, like it has to be addressed just because, and you don't have time to think more deeply about it, I suppose. But I do think that thinking more deeply and bringing the sorts of things you're talking about back would help inform the conversation and keep you all abreast of the sorts of impacts that are being had, whatever they are, to the investments you're making.
Okay. Other issues affecting the budget, and I see Connie's here and Mike is here. We are about to move on to a different way of tax foreclosure, and I'm wondering if there are any ways for us to sort of anticipate what that might mean to the county in terms of, as we go forward, reducing our buyback or purchasing of the delinquent tax rolls from the other communities. If we could give, are there some opportunities as we move through the NREM and we move to that surplus process that we are in the process of amending to realize some either, less outlays to other units of government and potentially quicker turnaround relative to the sale of those properties, and how might that impact the budget going forward?
Short answer, Mr. Chair, yes, there are many opportunities, I think, in the process. Connie and I and Steve from Connie's office have been working pretty diligently on moving this process forward, and I think we've already seen how the NREM process is going to assist us in taking a look at multiple properties at one time. I think the immediate impact we're going to see more when we get through the first court process, which is later this year. We'll be able to see, okay, how did that go? Can we increase the numbers? Was that too much? Was that too little? But I think the end result is going to be we're going to move these properties faster. We're going to have them ready for sale faster. And then as we address the ordinance changes and potentially linking with surplus auction, that would allow us to dispose of the properties and get them back on the tax roll. So I think that's certainly an opportunity. I don't know that we are far enough into it to quantify what the potential savings might look like year to year, but I'm very optimistic just based on how much progress we've already made just in the last month or so.
Other questions relative to the budget, relative to mandatory discretionary programs, fees and rates, or the expense levy document? I think we've had a good discussion with some suggestions and potential avenues. So if we can get a report back as we're going through the budget in the context of the capital side or the operational side, if there are costs that we need to cover relative to Chair Gibbs' suggestion on the comprehensive audit, energy audit. All right, we will then move on to 6A1, approval of claims and question cost. Those were emailed out. Any questions, comments, motions? Supervisor Lemmer?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a quick question. Thank you, Christy, for sending that in an Excel doc. What happens when, I sorted it by check number and there are missing check numbers? I'm assuming it's still the transaction number. If we are an internal control, but we don't have all of that information, I just feel like I'm missing something. So what do we do when we notice there's either a block or a check that's missing? It's under the column with transaction number, I believe.
What numbers are you looking at on there? Because I can just look it up.
I mean, there's a bunch of them. We're missing 105,403. We're missing 105,405 through 408. And there's just, a handful of them as they go down. I don't want to spend the time right now doing that. Maybe that's not, I just feel like, can you give me some direction on how I should approach this task? Because it just feels like.
There's two things. One, we had a settlement run that didn't run, so none of those checks went. And then secondly, if it's a void check, that doesn't come out the same way as it did in Kayenta. So I'll take one or two of the ones that you gave us, and then I can let you know if it's something I need to change. Change the report to include the canceled. They're called canceled in this one. The ones that are run all the way through the process are called complete. So then I'll just see what it is, because it could be something I need to really investigate, or it's one of those that we just put the status of canceled in there for you to have that complete list.
So would it be helpful if when I notice that I send you an email and just
bet.
say, hey, okay.
Yep.
All right.
Yep.
Thanks.
But I can do it right now. We'll get it back to you.
So the Excel format is helpful. So thank you, Christy, for doing that. And Gail for that suggestion. So any other questions? If not, what are your wishes? Supervisor Leahy, move to approve. Is there a second? Seconded by Chair Gibbs. Any discussion? If not, all is in favor will signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. That motion carries. And discussion on Regional Forensic Center funding plan. Jessica, are you leading that? If you can either grab the...
And we'll tag team this as she walks up here. So, I don't want to belabor the point that we've talked about this a number of, at the full board, you recently had a full presentation. But a lot has been happening. We had great news that, as you're aware, that through the budget building process, Marathon County was allocated $7 million through the discussions at Joint Finance and through the Building Commission with our other funds that we've been, that the county has previously allocated and that you allowed us to move forward with conceptual and schematic design for that building. We've also been talking with NTC. We've been really essentially taking what was our last projection for the facility, and that's in that $14.8 million range, and trying to identify what funding do we have, what funding also meets the terms of the State Building Commission parameters, for requirements around local match and trying to identify what is that gap. And we're working to do that and minimize that gap. As you know, we're still waiting for some word on the federal funding request that we have in for $2 million. But we've been having a lot of meetings with local stakeholders, and I'll talk about a couple, and then Jess can certainly add to it. As you know, we've been talking with NTC to identify, what does that relationship look like, and Corp Council and Jess are working to kind of add some flesh to the MOU that we would enter into for the siting of that building if we were going to do that on the campus. The next step was, we're not overly experienced in fundraising. At least I'm not, and I don't know that Jess is either. We do have people on our team that are more experienced, but we reached out to a local leader that is effective in that space to get some insight. Jess and Sarah from administration are working to essentially put together a Gantt chart of all the big kind of deadlines we have and identify what tasks need to get done by when to help us prioritize that work. We've reached out, as I said, to that local leader to get some insight on what has worked historically. And kind of the big takeaway that we have is we're going to be scheduling a I'll call it a stakeholder local leader informational session to tell them about the project. Because as much as Jess has been living the morgue task force for the last many moons, the rest of the world hasn't. And, in all the discussions we've had, people leave those discussions and they say this is much more than the traditional government forensic pathology system that you're talking about, and people are excited. So we need to make sure we have a strong way to tell that story in this first meeting that we're going to schedule for, it sounds like late August, early September, is really to do that and get people excited so that we can start to close that gap from a fundraising perspective. The other piece of that is we needed to have a mechanism through which people could actually donate. So the other meeting that we held, I met with the Community Foundation, and Jess and Sarah then moved forward with generating an application for the Community Foundation to serve as, for lack of a better term, the fiscal agent to essentially take in donations from multiple parties and then provide one single donation to the county for the project, very similar to what happened with the North Central Healthcare Pool project. So that has all been happening. At the same time, Jess has been working diligently with the task force to keep them apprised. So that's kind of where we are. We'll keep you informed. This isn't a request to say, hey, the county's got to come forward with the rest of the money right now. All of the meetings have been, I'll say, very positive in terms of the support, but we're putting together that strategy, working based on the direction we get from the task force. And I've probably stolen all your thunder, Jess, but.
The only thing I have to add is we've been working with the architects. They have been amazing. They're very familiar with facilities, morgues. On Monday, we're able to tour the Hennepin County Medical Examiner's Office. That place is amazing. I came back and I told Lance that we're upping our budget up to their budget and just taking their facility as our own. Obviously, we don't need that large of a space, but it was incredible to see. It gave us so many new ideas, and they kept making little points about, oh, this is what type flooring to use. And every time I looked at the architect who was with us, he's like, I know all of that. So I know that we're in really good hands for the plan. And our consulting architect was the same that consulted with them, MWL. So it'll be a very positive experience, and we'll have a beautiful facility at the end. So we're really excited.
All right, are there any questions? Supervisor Leahy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And just to confirm, when you say fundraising, and you mentioned the Community Foundation, are you mainly looking toward other nonprofits or those types of organizations, or will this be a true capital fundraising program where the general public will be making donations?
So I'd say we still have a lot of those things to nail down, but in our initial conversations with a couple of key local people that know fundraising a lot better than I do, their thought was it's primarily going to be driven through significant asks of local foundations. So the other thing I'll say we're doing is, trying to bolster that story of this is more than a traditional government department. There's a lot of ancillary benefits. We have North Central Wisconsin Regional Planning conducting some economic impact work for us. We provided them with the business plan to allow them to say, what does this mean from an economic development standpoint for the new people that would be coming in to utilize this service, but also from the, it's not creating a ton of jobs, but it is creating certainly a number of jobs, and they're highly professional jobs. It also has as we've talked about before, significant impact on the education system. So we're trying to get some more data to help tell that story, but overall, the reception has been strong, and I do think there's an opportunity for us to kind of have multiple pieces to this. One, the significant asks of local foundations and other entities. Two, the continuing the ask of local government. I mean, the state of Wisconsin has put in a significant amount of funding. We hope and expect to get some funding from the federal government. Marathon County, of course, has put in a significant amount, but we also have a strategy we're working to develop, and this was an idea that came from Chris, really to try to get other local governments, other counties and municipalities to see the benefit of this facility being here to them from a financial perspective, so that perhaps they also would contribute. And then lastly, they, at least having a mechanism where if someone felt strongly, they'd have the opportunity to provide some funding for the project. But right now, it's a lot more work is going into what really is our local match. We have the $2 million that clearly is local match, but we're working with NTC. As I said, it's not only the MOU, but figuring out how we're going to structure the land transaction, because NTC has indicated that they would be willing to contribute in kind equal to the purchase price for the land. So we have our Excel spreadsheet out, and we're going through all those things, and also all the local match. The county board, just one example, you approved in 2020, I believe it was, the purchase of a cooler for purposes of mass fatality preparedness. That can be repurposed within the facility, which is something we would otherwise have to purchase. We're going to note that on our in-kind local match, as well as other things that we can bring over to the facility that we'd otherwise have to purchase. So trying to make that gap as small as possible, and then the architects also are doing their best to certainly not grow it beyond the 14.8.
I would hope that we would reach out to the funeral directors and crematoriums and ask them for contributions, because this is a significant benefit to them in terms of expediting processing, and there's a benefit to them.
Yeah, that's a great segue. I forgot to mention, the one thing we forgot to mention was working with the task force. They gave us some direction to come up with some work groups to identify some key areas, and that certainly is one. Identifying marketing, having the tools necessary to tell the story, a fundraising component, but also leads to really tell the story to those, for lack of a better word, kind of industry leaders. So the funeral directors, the medical systems, Dr. Dodson is kind of going to lead that effort with regard to interfacing with each of the health systems, because there's a significant impact similarly to the health systems. Significant benefit.
Any other questions? Chair Gibbs.
Maybe just one comment. I don't know that it would, has been really explained a lot, but obviously I've been in several of the meetings with the task force. Is the opportunity to have organ donation and tissue donation that is pretty significant, that is going to benefit the greater area.
Chair, or Cody.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'm just doing the quick math. So we're about $5 million to go yet in terms of funding, when you account for the state funding that was allocated out and then our funding. Is that correct?
Our gap, we think, is going to be closer to the 3.5 if we have the federal funding coming through as well. But we haven't officially gotten that, and everyone again is telling us that, hey, it's a great project. But to your point, yes, if you just add the 7 from the state and the $2 million from Marathon County, and then if you pencil in some in-kind contributions from NTC, you're right around that, less than 5 million.
Cody?
And just to follow up, so that 3 million is kind of the estimate of where this campaign the goal of this campaign then?
Correct.
Other questions? Right, it's here more for information than it is for action at this time. Thank you for your continued effort and advocacy. All right, we will then we're going to skip over the closed session. We'll go to budget transfers, Wisconsin Election Commission subgrant. Kim, do you want to?
Sure, I can just speak to this real briefly. This has been a project that's been in the works at the Election Commission for at least 3 years, looking at the absentee envelopes that we use now, excuse me, for elections. And there's been lots of concern from the legislature that there are elements on the envelopes that don't meet with state statute. And so the legislature has requested that the Election Commission look at that, and they have done so. We have templates that the Election Commission will hope to approve at their August 4th meeting. It's a total redesign of the envelope, which they understand will mean great expense for counties and municipalities to totally repurchase envelopes from our suppliers. So what they did was they put together a $600,000 grant to give out to the municipalities, and in the packet there's kind of a breakdown of how they did that. It's 2 municipalities based on the voting age of the citizens. So we have a number of municipalities in Marathon County that we provide envelopes for. Some of the municipalities are large enough that they can order a quantity on their own, have their return addresses pre-printed, but there are a number of municipalities that are just too small to do that. And so we place the order with our vendor Color Vision out in Edgar. And so what I am asking for is a budget transfer for the funds that are allocated to the municipalities for which we provide absentee envelopes. And that's what that amount there in the transfer is.
Inherent in that budget transfer is an acceptance of that grant. So are there any questions? Supervisor Hart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And just a quick question. If we weren't to accept the grant, we would be eating the cost for printing these and sending these to the municipalities, correct?
Somewhat, yes. We always bill out the municipalities for envelopes, so we pay for them up front. And then when I do election billing, the municipalities reimburse us for those. So we would be out the money up front, and then the municipalities would reimburse. So if you do accept this grant, then we would not bill out the municipalities for the amount on that schedule that they're allocated. They would pay for any envelopes that they would get in addition to that amount, but I would deduct their allocated amount. So the municipalities would be eating the cost. And I will tell you, the new envelopes have color on them, and they're doubled in price from what our current envelopes cost.
Any other questions? Chair Gibbs.
So I totally understand and accept the premise on the grant, but is there an additional cost then to us, the county, for printing outside of the municipalities? Since the municipalities are paying everything, there's no additional cost to the county.
No, we'll get reimbursed for everything.
Okay. I'll make a motion to approve.
Been moved to approve the budget transfer from in acceptance of the Wisconsin Election Commission subgrant for absentee envelopes. Seconded by Supervisor Hart. Any discussion? If not, all those in favor will signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed, no. That motion carries. We'll now move on to 2024 budget assumptions, and I would direct your attention to an email that came out from Administrator Leonard earlier today, and I'll turn it over to Administrator Leonard.
Sure, and if I can, Kim, if you'd be so kind as to put up what is on the monitor at the podium. As Chair Robinson said, this is the document that was sent to you, and it's up on the screen. It's not overly earth-shattering, but these are just it's really to start the conversation relative to budget assumptions that we will then use in terms of building the budget. You will, of course, have the opportunity to make modifications to those, but I wanted to start the conversation and just talk through kind of what our initial rationale was with respect to each of these. And I put in dollar amounts for each of the items where I think that dollar amounts are relatively easy and to arrive at, and also somewhat meaningful. So I'll start with on the revenue side. Sales tax is, of course, a big thing we talk about, right? And you can actually, if you're interested, you can go to the Department of Revenue page and you can see there's a little bit of a lag, but you can see exactly what our monthly sales tax collections are for Marathon County and any other county in the state of Wisconsin. As we talked about in the budget kickoff meeting, Marathon County has historically adopted a pretty conservative approach. I wouldn't say overly conservative, but a relatively conservative approach to sales tax projections. And the thought process, as I understand it, excuse me, it's relatively simple. It's a lot easier to deal with a smaller amount of CIP rollover 2 years after than it is to cut programs and services in the middle of a budget year when your sales tax projections fall short. So the $15.75 million is about a 1.75% increase over what we budgeted in 2023 for sales tax. You'll recall in the budget document, and you can certainly pull it up, it's about $13.45 million that we budgeted for sales tax. So a small increase. I can tell you, if you look at the Department of Revenue, we are certainly on pace to exceed that amount. But again, that is a conservative amount each year for a forecast, so that we're not in the unenviable position to have to cut services because we relied upon revenue that didn't come to pass. So that revenue then rolls over into that CIP fund balance for us to use 2 years following, in the year following the audit, I should say. So that's the thought process there. With respect to shared revenue, this is that positive news that we discussed the last several meetings. Based on the new formula that was arrived at through the budget process, Marathon County is getting approximately $1.3 million of additional revenue. That puts our total shared revenue dollar amount at $5.231 million. So I put that in the projected on the projected revenue side. Now, moving forward, of course, a portion of that total $5.23 million, specifically the amount that of the increase, that $1.3 million, as I understand it, that amount is dependent upon sales tax collections at the state level. That's how it was funded. So as state sales tax grows, our share of that state sales tax for purposes of shared revenue would grow as well.
If I could just ask a question, do we know the timeline, the budget, state budget dealt with a 24-25 fiscal year payout? Do we know what we will see in 2024? I know there's a meeting. Are we overestimating it because they've got a July 1 through June 30th distribution timeframe, which could carry it into the following budget year? So do we have any idea on when we'll see that money?
That's a great question. I don't. I think that meeting you referred to is the perfect place to start to ask some of those logistical questions. And as I alluded to previously, my understanding is that it's the portion of the shared revenue, that increase portion, that is going to be, for lack of a better term, kind of dependent on sales tax growth. So if we have a really bad sales tax year, theoretically, if it retracts, the state share of sales tax retracts, that additional amount, that $1.3 million, could go down. That historically has happened very infrequently, but I think those are the questions in terms of timing and in terms of what amount of shared revenue is really dependent upon state sales tax growth, are questions to ask at that upcoming WCA meeting, but I'm not aware on timing at this point.
I think the preliminary indication was the June payment and the November payment was when that increase would come. So it would be in 2024. There will be nothing in 2023.
Certainly a very, very good question. Kind of similar to that, there has been some discussion about.
So if I could,
Oh, yeah.
if I could just follow up, just so I understand, the June payment would be a 2023 through 24 fiscal year, for which no increase is allocated. So I think we have to pay particular attention, and we may have to adjust these assumptions. And it may be, if they carry through, it would actually, the second payment in the fiscal year would come near the end of the state's fiscal year, which puts us in our following fiscal year. So I think we have to pay particular attention to that, because it may be halved, depending upon how they allocate it.
It's a very, very good point. Any other questions relative to shared revenue, at least what the initial thoughts are, subject, of course, to that, whether or not it's essentially half that amount? All right. The next piece is utility tax. We are fortunate in that we are one of the counties that do have power generation within our county, and we do receive about $1.85 million in utility tax. There was some discussion similar to shared revenue about updating that formula, and it does appear that the formula is updated. It's just unclear to me whether or not Marathon County is going to be impacted. My read of it, at least initially, was that we should see some increase based on some changes to the formula based on megawatt production. However, when I reached out to Wisconsin Counties Association initially, their response was they didn't think it applied to us, as it was, as they read the language, to be more targeted to those power generation facilities that were driven by renewable energy. But more to learn there. I kept it at a flat projection for that reason, but perhaps there's the opportunity for that to increase. Moving on to general transportation aids. This is always a bit of a rolling of the dice, because it's not just what does Marathon County do in terms of a 5-year rolling average that we've talked about. It's how do we compare in that regard with the rest of the state. So for that reason, we certainly did have a significant amount of expenditures relative to transportation in 23. So I'm hoping that will be positively impacted, but if at all, it would be minimal. So that's the reason for the 1%. The rest of the items on here are really driven by, at least the next three, a recommendation from administration that I'll make clearer as we move forward in the budget, that, I think it's sound fiscal practice to increase those rates and fees that we have in the rate and fee schedule by our cost to do business. And our cost to do business is, like everything else, is going up. We simply haven't changed our fees as frequently as the private sector has. So you'll see that I just inserted, at least for a discussion point, a suggestion of a 1.5%. I'm not saying that 1.5% should be the fee increase, but I'm hoping that our collections would kind of at least hit that amount, because it will impact our budget. Not overly significantly, but every little bit helps. Then with respect to miscellaneous revenues, and Christy can certainly elaborate if you have questions, the thought process here is that interest income, for example, those are those things within that miscellaneous revenue section. We're projecting a slight increase based on the market, but that is not something, that's not an overly significant amount. I don't know, Christy, if there's anything else you want to add there, if there's any fees. She's shaking her head no. So, that's the thought process relative to revenue. There's a lot we, of course, don't know that, I don't think is overly helpful for discussion right now. Things like net new construction. It will be what it will be. If I have to guess, it's going to be 1.75 to 2%. Christy's thinking no, but she's thinking 1.5. I'm hoping for the 1.75. But those are the big numbers that, at least to start. Of course, with respect to sales tax, that is a conservative estimate. If we get later in the budget process and we need to project a bit higher to, for various reasons, such as debt service or something else, we can do that. But I didn't want to get into the, I don't think it's overly helpful right now to talk about projected levy rates or anything like that. Is there anything, really the thing I'm hoping for is some feedback, anything in terms of projections that, apart from the conversation we've had on shared revenue, which I think is very helpful, hey, this doesn't make sense, or we think we should be heading in a different direction relative to projections as we build the budget on the revenue side?
I would just make the comment that as we take this to the county board and present it, the fees and fines, the charges that we make, I think we have to just reiterate that is something that we have asked all of the standing committees to review, and that they have a role in establishing those. While we don't have a lot of fees associated with this committee's jurisdiction, several of the others do, and I think just reiterating that they have a role to play in making sure we reach those goals.
Sure. And I guess maybe in terms of process, that would be helpful. Not saying it needs to happen today, but whether it's at this committee or executive committee, if there is a kind of a comprehensive or global approach that, to borrow a term you guys have used earlier in your meeting, staff can build that into that rate and fee document, which is kind of what you've seen in other counties. We can say 2023, you see the base fee. If we do across the board, add 2% or 3%, we can populate what that next column would look like. I'm not saying that is the direction you want to go, but in terms of process, is that something you want to have a conversation about here, or to your point, Mr. Chair, is that something at the standing committee level that you want each of them to do that? My only fear is that it's not overly consistent if it's done that.
The difficulty of doing an across-the-board increase is that some of those are statutorily limited.
Correct.
And so we would have to somehow differentiate between those where we're statutory constrained as to what we can charge versus those where we are trying to recover costs.
Yeah, of course we can't, to your point, we can't increase fees that we're not statutorily permitted to do so, but, yeah, Chris.
They're somewhat segregated out because fines and licenses are actually more the ones that you're going to be looking at that are statutorily regulated than the straight up public charges. So there is some differentiation within the estimate already, so we'll make sure we pay attention to that too.
Any other revenue questions or comments? Interpreting that we're headed in the right direction, or at least at this point, we don't think we're heading in the wrong direction from silence. Please let me know if that's not accurate. Otherwise, I can move on to expenditures. And as part of your budget priority work over the last couple of meetings, which was approved by the full board in June, you provided some very clear direction relative to salaries and wages. You put up to 3%, so I included that in that initial estimate. Our 6.5% is based on some initial conversations we've had with our health insurance consultant, and we're going to be getting more information from the consultant shortly relative to health insurance and our experience through the first quarter and now half of the year. But overall, you'll see the total personnel costs, which are a significant portion of our budget, and it's the portion we have control over. Some of the things, as we've talked about with jail meals and other things, are largely, it's just the cost of doing business. But you'll see the total personnel costs that we're projecting based on each of those items in our initial best information we have is right around that 3.7% expenditure assumptions area. So happy to answer any questions kind of relative to those. Christy really can elaborate on it, but you'll see some pretty very moderate increase relative to the Wisconsin retirement system at this point, and minimal increases really across the board.
I know we had a good amount of discussion, and Supervisor Marshall had initiated it relative to health insurance, and we're still looking at a significant increase. Are there opportunities for us to as we're evaluating the delivery mechanism and provisions to have an impact on that number?
Well, certainly, plan design changes can impact that number if you stay, based on the proposals that we receive, if we stay fully insured, plan design changes can modify that. We'll know more when we meet with our health insurance consultant, which again, I understand is next week. But yeah, the short answer to that is certainly, and if there is, based on the proposals that we've received, if there's an advantage to move to the self-funded side of the delivery system, we're gonna have a lot of decisions we need to make that will have an impact on that number. But the proposals have closed. USI has been evaluating the proposals that we received, so next week's meeting should be very informative for staff, and then we can come back to you in the very near future and give you kind of our recommendations relative to how to move forward.
I would also, missing in there is our utility cost. I would ask that our expenditure assumptions include utility costs. That keeps it front and center in context of what we're spending, how we're spending it, and others. So, and particularly because of the ARPA supplemental appropriation last year, I think it's important that we look at utility costs as one of those expenditure assumptions. We should realize some savings because of the market conditions, but I think also because of our reducing the footprint and hopefully some energy assistance. I think that would be helpful and enlightening to the board, if that's possible.
Yeah, we can certainly add that as a expenditure assumption, kind of a row at the bottom of that chart or that table.
Other thoughts? If not, we need to recommend this to the board, and your meeting is taking place next week. We also, the question is when will the committee meet again? But if we receive some changes that might modify the health insurance numbers, we could incorporate those at that time.
Yeah, I guess the one thing I'll say, Mr. Chair, is, this isn't set in stone. In fact, I didn't even save it as a PDF because I know all these things are going to change. As we build the budget, I have no doubt we'll have some modifications to make. This is really just the starting point for staff to start to put fingers to keys as we build the budget in our new financial system.
Any other questions? Then we need to make this recommendation to the county board pursuant to our budget timelines that is due to the board in July. So we would need to advance this to the board. So I would look for a motion.
Mr. Chair, I have one last question. Why do we believe that the healthcare would go up 6.5%? What is that number based on?
The short answer is based on a conversation with our consultant, based on our claim experience through the first quarter that we had through this year. I haven't had conversations with our consultant, and we should have more information from them next week after their review of the proposals. But that is the short answer is based on the best information we had at the time.
Thank you.
And I should say, I believe that is based on the assumption if we would stay fully insured. We haven't had information from them as of yet relative to a potential change to to self-funded, excuse me.
Is that on the table for next week's discussion?
Yes. Yeah, my understanding is we went out to market with respect to both fully insured and self-funded, and we'll see what their recommendations are.
And you'll update us in the county board. All right, any other questions? If not, what are your wishes relative to the budget assumptions? Supervisor Hart.
I will move to advance the 2024 budget assumptions to the full board.
Does that include a provision for utility payments?
Yes, including a provision for utilities on there as well. So we have a good estimate of that.
Is there a second? Seconded by Supervisor Leahy. Any discussion? If not, all those in favor will signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed, no. That motion carries. All right, we'll now jump to the 2023 through 25 state budget. I don't know that we have a lot to report. There is a webinar next week with the Wisconsin Counties Association on the 19th where they'll get into the shared revenue payments. There were a significant number of other changes, incremental increases in funding for others, but we'll continue to monitor those. The critical issue will be the shared revenue and the payment schedule associated with that. It could have a positive, well, it will have a positive impact on it. And the question is what fiscal year it will impact us going forward. But we'll continue to try to track that. There were a lot of incremental increases in funding for social service programs and general transportation aid and others. But I encourage you, if you are available, to look at the Wisconsin Counties Association invites for that shared revenue seminar next week. That takes us to the update by staff on the 2024 capital improvement program development.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. So this is the update, our first glance, if you will, at what we've been engaging as far as the CIP for 2024. I think my main objectives from today are to give you sort of a process review, but also some suggestions that I have just to share with you based on the fact that this is the first year I've been through this process from the beginning. So last year I kind of hopped into the middle and then we moved through it, but now having been able to see things as from start to finish, if you will, there's some things that myself and facilities staff have seen, and I think other departments as well, that would probably help facilitate the process moving forward. Providing our opportunities, a little crack at humor there, but just there's this brief explanation in terms of the opportunity that Chair Robinson's mentioned a few times already, but essentially not necessarily saying it has to happen next year, but providing the opportunity that if you wanted to move in that direction, that is there and that is teed up, if you will, for the decision to move to a construction phase versus the traditional approach, which is the design first and then construct, which would pull you out of the ARPA timeframe. Then I'll go through the 2024 project submissions so you get a look at what we've received from departments and the main pieces that people are looking at. This again is not coming with a recommendation, but more of a broad brush of here's everything that people are thinking would be useful of doing for one reason or another. Then lastly, next steps and Q&A. So as far as the process review goes, I think, based on experience this year, it makes a lot more sense for the county to start this process earlier in the year, and primarily to buy some time for the conversations to take place between facilities and departments themselves, so that, as you see on the second bullet point, that facilities would obtain the cost estimates, et cetera, versus the departments. Now that's not a statement about whether or not departments do a good job. They do a wonderful job of what they're asked to do in terms of providing cost estimates and justifications for the projects they bring to us. What I've seen though is that sometimes the vendor's response won't be the same as if it came from facilities, or sometimes they don't ask the right question of the department head or vice versa to get at what really is a more functional sort of project appropriate solution for whatever the conversation is. And so I think based on my understanding, a lot of work happens on the back end of things where you're revising, and you'll see a couple of projects in here that we are currently revising based on the fact that when we see them, we recognize when it comes to us on the deadline, that's not the product that they need. They really need this other product. And so then you have to initiate the same process again. So rather than doing it on the back end, it makes sense to me to just say, let's get the ducks lined up earlier in the year, and then we can do the same thing that we're doing now, but doing it on the front end, which will ultimately make it a more streamlined approach. It puts the departments in a better position, and it also ensures that when a project comes forward, there's the focus on function and durability and longevity and efficiency and everything else that is, incorporated within that facility's perspective. Similarly, identifying potential opportunities. This year, we've, as I mentioned just now, preparing for those in addition to more of the traditional CIP. So this year is fast tracking a couple of things to provide the opportunity. I'm going to really mess up the opportunity there. Sorry. Hopefully we'll get away from that. But anyway, the other thing would be renovation versus new. So the classic example of that, which is actually both of these, is the Sheriff's Office, TRC, and a storage building they have out there. So it had been in the plan for some time with a number associated with it, but when we looked at it, we're like, you can't really get what they have at the number that's in there. So we met with them and said, here's what we think we can do, here's what that looks like, got them to buy into the concept and said, we can renovate this at a cost point that's lower than what's in the plan right now, and it still puts them in a situation where they have better usability of the facility, and for the next 20 or 30 years, they're covered. So better than find another place to try to build something new and then not build off of what you've already got. I'm saying things here that you probably already know, but as far as ARPA is concerned, there is the December 24 deadline for sort of the encumbrance or expenses of ARPA funds. Projects like roads or buildings, things like that, have through 2026. Is like ARPA, the federal government's perspective wasn't, if you start something, you have to end it at December 24. So you can continue that through completion. But again, that's what brought a couple of these projects to the fore, to say, if ARPA funds are going to be used for them, then they need to be positioned well so that that can happen. The additional projects for consideration are, I just mentioned, the Sheriff's Office's TRC and storage facility. Currently, we're at a point where we can say that 1.65 million is approximately where it's at. It's not a firm estimate yet because we haven't got to the schematic design piece, but it's helpful that it's a facility that we know well, and we've completed the design RFPs for that so that we can get the process moving forward to provide the focus we need. Same with Lakeview Professional Plaza. So this was a project that had been in the plan as well, but the phase of the project, if you remember, or if you don't know, the county's put a lot of money into Lakeview Professional Plaza, which is where the special education program is housed, kind of back tucked away on the Lakeview campus there. And there's been a lot of renovations that have taken place in that building. One of the last things that needed to be done was the plumbing, specifically underneath the building. The initial approach was to say, let's take some PVC and sleeve those pipes so that you kind of renew the piping under the building. But upon further inspection, of course, the plumbing inside the building hadn't yet been touched. And so it's still 2-inch cast iron pipe. And so if you're going to take on the first phase, which was primarily under, it made a lot more sense for us to say, let's look at what needs to happen in the building so that you address that concern, and then essentially that puts a bow on Lakeview Professional Plaza, and it also addresses something that is currently preventing the county from utilizing that building more than it is now. It's been okay with special education in there, but there have been issues with the pipes this year. Don't need to go into further detail other than that they've been unfortunate issues, primarily dealing with the fact that they are 2-inch pipe, it's narrow, and we've had to make some sort of tactical decisions to address that situation, and we have, but the root cause is still there and needs to be done. But upon completion of that project, should it be done, the county would then have large spaces for agencies or whatever the county deemed necessary in that space, but it would be able to be, you could put people in there and have no worries about anything that I'm talking about. So The firm estimates I mentioned at the bottom are just to say that we'll have a schematic design towards the end of September. So I put by October there, but it will be by the end of September so that it's in line with the budget development so that you have a ballpark figure of what it looks like now. But should that be something that moves forward, you'll know that long before you're getting to really the heart of the budget discussion, you'll know what that cost would be. For rolling stock, it's not strange to any of you that there's a policy update that's needed. That would also, in my opinion, need to incorporate the fleet management aspect, which we've got already with facilities and CPZ and working with Enterprise, but we're exploring the fleet options for the Sheriff's Office, which is looking to move forward, Social Services, Health Department, and potentially others, where, especially in the Social Services and Health Department, you're at a point now where the IRS reimbursement is 65.5 cents per mile. So if somebody takes their personal vehicle, they get that reimbursement, which is what they deserve for taking their vehicle. However, if you were to engage into a fleet management system with them, your operating costs can be as low as around 42 cents per mile. So the county would realize almost a 30%, 33% savings just by engaging in a fleet versus reimbursing people for their POVs. And then on top of that, the longer you build in your fleet, the more equity you build within the program, which then lowers your operational costs, which are essentially reduced to fuel and bringing it in for regular maintenance. So that's an option that will help leverage the current funding that's outdated right now and hasn't been changed, but could be used to help subsidize a deeper dive into the fleet world, if you will. The total rolling stock request is still in progress. We know what they've historically been. The policy says it needs to be an average of the last 5 years. I think if it hasn't changed in the last 5 years, then we know what that funding amount is. But the point is that I think this is an area where we might be able to, get some budget security, and we're still looking into what it would look like for social services and health department. Recurring funds, real quick, we always have the parking lot replacement in there. Also the PC replacement for CCITC. That $347,000 is currently a levy outlay. It might be something that we can look at running through an internal service fund instead, which would allow you to build departments, and then you'd be able to kind of capture some of those costs through grants and things like that. So it's not going to revolutionize that area, but you'd realize a little bit of savings and it wouldn't be 100% levy. CWA, now I'm getting into the project requests. As you know, CWA is not directly tied to us, but we still keep their budget in ours and keep their CIP in ours so that we're all aware of what each other are doing. So their main project is modernizing their tower, roughly $600,000 of federal funding through the FAA, but they have no CIP funding request. I should note too, as I get into these, if there's a particular project you want to see more detail on, just let me know, and I can either send the whole committee or you individually the project request form, which tends to have a few more details, but I try to pick out the ones that illustrate the point the most for today's update. Solid waste, they're working on a gas well installation. Then they've got the Phase A of Closure Area B and a landfill compactor. Again, they use this with their own funds. They have to establish a long-term care fund for closure of areas. None of this is tied to CIP funding, but you can see that they've got some significant projects going on, and they also are looking at potentially for the landfill compactor, if they don't go new, they'll look at refurbished options to see if they can realize some savings and still get what they need. CPZ, they've looked into getting a hydro seeder. There's some cost savings there currently highway and parks use a hydro seeder. So in the event, in all situations that any of them would need it, the county would have one on hand, and it's difficult to find one to rent, or it's increasingly difficult. So they're requesting that as part of their project. Now we get into several parks projects. I'll explain each of the pieces here, but also why I've got two different amounts. So for the Dells of the Eau Claire, there's a dump station, and now that is required. Essentially what happened was the county had not crossed a threshold based on state regulation, and then the regulation changed. So we didn't do anything different, it's just that they changed regulations, so now we have to have a dump station, or essentially you have to close the campground. So that one would fall under the compliance or regulatory piece in terms of how we currently rank projects. There's also the bathroom and shower installation and camper cabinet installation. Those are both looking to add opportunities for campers to come utilize the park, but also increase revenue. So, I know we've talked about increasing fees and park fees, but if you did install those sorts of things, you'd want to figure out a way to recoup all or part of the cost, or to even, if you use ARPA, for instance, as a front-end investment, how do you then leverage the ARPA investment to increase fees to a point that you help build some sort of reserve so that future projects could be funded at least partially through that sort of thing. And then parks, which has been tasked by administration for a long time in terms of how can you generate more revenue as one of the few departments that can do it. How can you, within realistic expectations and without kind of getting out of control, do that and provide some relief and support for your internal programming. The total request is $670,000. That's all of that. But if you peel it out just the dump station, that's $134,000. And that $134,000 includes the percentage of contingency that would have been applied to the entire project. The Big O Plain Park, this is something that's more around revenue opportunities and enhancing opportunities. So bathroom and shower facility. You could do 1 or 2 facilities, and a lot of these particular requests are based on surveys they've done of campers who go to those places. And so I think that Park's argument would be that people are asking for these things so that those individuals who are already coming and others would show up. Now, again, your ability to capture revenue based on all these is going to be somewhat limited, but nevertheless, it would improve the facility. And the request there is just shot, $468,000. Cherokee Park, this is one that is it's a failing bathroom block construction, so it's really crossing into that. It's not a regulatory compliance issue now, but it's one that it's on the horizon, so it's definitely something in terms of compliance that you'd want to do in terms of end of life. Obviously, if you deferred it, there's a risk to the groundwater, and as I've kind of tongue-in-cheek said before, if we're holding other people accountable to this sort of thing, then we probably want to make sure we repair this one on our property. The 9 Mile Rec area, this one is a little more complicated, but the nutshell here is that there's a septic system there that is 30 years old. It's not able to meet the capacity it was designed for, so that restricts the use of the facilities there. So not only is it something that it's wrapped up in compliance, CPZ was also consulted, and their guidance was you need to replace it. So it's a compliance issue, but there's also the revenue opportunity, and that currently you have to limit who can actually use it. But it's a popular location. So replacing this not only gets the septic system where it needs to be, it also puts the park into a place where more people can use it and larger parties can use it, like it was originally designed 30 years ago. The Eastgate Hall renovation, this is one of the largest meeting and event spaces that Parks has. I've got prioritized projects there, so there's a few issues there. We know that the boilers are being done now. That was something more of a core fundamental to the building. These things are all, they're not regulatory or compliance, but the flooring, for instance, the leveling agent that they used 25 years ago when they put the current floor in is now pulverized into a powder. And so the flooring is not falling apart, but there are some pockets where it's falling apart, and it's an issue. So as you imagine, if there's lots of traffic on the floor, that's just going to get progressively worse. Updating ceiling tile and acoustic tiling, the sound in there can really bounce around, so that's something that you could do. Facade improvements, there's a couple of things there that would kind of help it mirror the other buildings in that area. And then there's replacing the windows, which was the original request. But this is another example where the department had asked, okay, well, how can we replace the windows? And they looked at it and they got some cost estimate, but upon further inspection, when you look at the actual siding on the building, you can't really take the windows off and then just put the siding back. So the two are inextricably intertwined in the sense that when you do one, you need to do the other. And to be frank, the siding is also in need of replacement. The windows are even older than the floor. And the last time they renovated this, 25 years ago, they basically wrapped the wood-framed windows in aluminum and called it a day. So it was an improvement at the time, but it wasn't something that was going to last, much longer than it has now. But the flooring certainly looks worse. The windows and siding probably have some sort of R factor involved in terms of insulation, because the walls are actually built in a really unique way as well. They're not kind of standard measurement construction as you would have today, which they're smaller. It's narrower construction than it is today. So that also poses some complications. But nevertheless, the request for all of that is roughly $400,000, but I just peeled a couple of them out just to suggest that if we didn't want to do them all or couldn't do them all based on available funding, we have identified the issues. We know the approximate cost, or we know the costs, I should say, and you could do one or the other. And Jamie and I have talked about priorities and two from her perspective and which one would make the most sense, if not all of them. The Marathon Junction, this is one that's tied into the West Side Master Plan in terms of what do we do with this space. So you've got the aging splash pad, the building itself is underutilized, the playground's aging. The plan would be $120,000 as kind of an extension of, okay, now is this the next area for the West Side Master Plan to address, and what would that look like? And this is something that Jamie's spoken about in the past in terms of the various pieces of that overall West Side plan. Medical examiner you've heard about already today, so I won't go into the building, but they have a vehicle replacement need, and that their current vehicles have high mileage. They're getting to have more mechanical issues. There's also the piece that as part of the new facility, there's a livery service that the forensic center would be able to provide, and having a refrigerated vehicle for that would be ideal. Similarly, not to get too into the weeds in terms of the medical examiner's world, but if you were to replace these vehicles, it would be really nice for staff if you could have a separation between the driving space and the rear of the space. So those are all considerations we're looking into. But as you'll see with anything dealing with vehicles, we're exploring a fleet option with that concurrent to the other pieces.
I have one thing.
Yep.
Just one thing to add, when Jess and I were speaking before about, one of our strategies with respect to that 14.8 million is identifying as much local match to make sure we leverage all of the 7 million from the state of Wisconsin. This is one of those opportunities where the project itself, we're going to dive into the language, but the project itself calls for that livery service to be part of it. And to the extent we can address a need we have outside of whether or not there's a new forensic science center, we do need to replace these vehicles. So to the extent we can replace the vehicles and then leverage the funding used to do that toward that local match required to access the 7 million, I think is just sound, prudent fiscal management. So that's going to be one thing we dive into with respect to this project as well.
Yeah, and I could also add that, this includes like a complete replacement for all the vehicles. So you could do it in a way where you have multiple approaches to this, depending on how the match works out, but also what does the fleet option even look like if there is one. For CCITC, there's a number of projects. One of them is a workday enhancement, which is the continuation of the implementation and building more complexity into the reporting and other programs that are already built into the system. Similarly, the moving a critical IT hub, that's about the fact that we're going to be moving away from River Drive where it's currently located. So whatever the future state of River Drive is, the county's IT hub cannot be there. So this is something that has to move, and the project is in for CIP next year. And I know we're already looking at that too as part of a couple other projects in terms of how that would dovetail with the other projects. Updating jail cameras, this is just straightforward, updating 20 cameras on the west side of the jail. Then you get into city-county asset management. So integrating that into Workday in the sense that both entities would have the same program to use to manage assets. And right now there's a variety of approaches across departments. So in my opinion, when it comes to IT, the more you can standardize, the better. So this would be one way you could do it so that everybody in the city and the county is on the same page, especially since we have that CCITC arrangement in the first place, which having that standardized approach makes CCITC's life easier as well. They don't have to know 5 or 6 different approaches to it. They just have to know one. The room you're in right now, putting in microphones so that we don't have to worry about those any longer. So it would be more along the lines of what we're talking into here, but around the room so that there would be access for everybody. Contract management, same idea. In the past, before I got here, but I know that the previous Corp Council and others had worked on how would you improve contracts across the county and how they're done and the process for getting them in play. This would be helping you track all of those so that when something comes up, the system would, for example, like tell you, hey, by the way, this contract's renewing at the end of the year, and you need to do something about that. Fiber optics for bug tussle. This is essentially taking all the dark fiber that's out there in terms of it's not being used right now and turning it on so that the county has the ability to utilize that fiber as part of the partnership we've had with bug tussle.
Is that a one-time or ongoing?
I believe it's one time, but I'd have to double check. So as a whole, those projects come in just at $961,000, which isn't surprising given that technology is increasingly expensive for all kinds of reasons, but also sort of the arena for ne'er-do-wells to show up more often than we'd like them to. Emergency management, this is just a vehicle replacement, so we're exploring a fleet option. Then we get into highway projects. So highway, to their credit, their projects are always very dialed in. They've got resurfacing projects here, and you'll see that the CIP request is just a portion of the overall budget for each project. So that's just the county's share. You have 2 bridge replacements and a culvert replacement and a culvert extension. Again, the county's got a share of the overall budget for all those except for the culvert replacement. That would likely get roped into bridge and culvert aid. They've got their annual paving program, which still is 30 to 34 miles per year, maintaining that PASER rating of 7, so that work would be taking place on County Highway X and R and U. The CIP request would be just shy of $3 million with the vehicle registration fee accounting for the balance. And then the Abbotsford Highway parking lot is in need of replacing. And so Jim and I have talked about potential of finding funding elsewhere. I think it was too early in the year when we talked about it, but if we get towards the end of the year where we might be able to look at what we have currently in our budgets, we might be able to address that this year. We'll see. UWSP Wausau. This is a tale of 2 projects. The restroom renovations, if you were, they're sort of original build, like the pool. Like if anybody wants an architectural study of the 1950s and 60s, go check out the pool. Or these restrooms. They're functional, right, but they're just dated. So that's one of the projects. The more sort of fundamental issue, and this is getting back to, when the county back in the day built the buildings and then, essentially, every year they have some funding from the UW system, but that's primarily wrapped up in personnel and some other pieces. But the county's contribution is just shy of $60,000 a year to maintain, provide maintenance on the buildings. And of course, at the end of the day, we own the buildings, we own the equipment within them. And so this project is related to the central heating plant. And everything in there that we're talking about for this project is end of life. They need to be replaced. The equipment's obsolete. In many cases, you can't find parts for it. The CIP request you see there for $372,000 is an approach to resolving that. We're also revising it to provide an alternative option. It is higher cost, but it's one of those steps into taking a more direct role in some of these things we have historically, and also integrating all of that into the county's automated systems more directly, so that if you're an HVAC or maintenance tech, you can get in and see what's going on versus not really knowing or just counting on UW's folks to take care of it, which they've done a great job of, I should say, with the resources that they've had. But it's boilers and controls, and if anybody wants a really cool tour of the central plant, let me know, because the boilers are massive. But it's quite the facility, and it's tied into the entire campus for heating especially. So even things like Marathon Hall, which is sitting there not being used, the heating for Marathon Hall is tied to this plant. The cooling isn't, but you've got various pieces of that campus that are all being fed by this. And so there's no real easy way around it other than to say it's end of life. And when you get to end of life like this is, you have a sunk cost in it no matter what you do. So that's something just to keep in mind, and I mentioned that because I think I'm getting close to the library. Oh, there it is. So the library chiller project. This is a continuation of a project that was designed and schematic design from last year. So the current HVAC is essentially end of life. The water costs are increasing. The project overall cost is $3 million. I can tell you that $750,000 of that is wrapped up in contingency and inflation writ large. So just in the time that we've been looking at doing this in the last year, you've had the costs for this go up over $300,000. So to give you an idea of what's happening when you look at some of these real big pieces of air handlers, boilers, chillers, and things like that, it's the market for them is really out of whack. I wanted to give you a sense of what the current operating costs look like. So this is just 2022, and only water use. It's not electricity, it's not maintenance, it's nothing else. But you can see in the first quarter that our bill for the water was $264. And then right around May, something happened. And the bill went up to $7,800 for that quarter. Then the third quarter, unsurprisingly, it got warmer. So you got $27,000. And then the tail end of the year in the fourth quarter, you're looking at 14 grand. So this is a piece of equipment that just on water uses $50,000 a year to run itself. So it's like a very large swamp cooler. And though this is not every drop of water, it's 99.9% of it is that chiller. So if you look at approximately $50K a year in water use with rates likely to increase over time, then you're saving, even at the current rates, you're saving $1 to $1.25 million out of the gate just based on the life expectancy of the equipment, which could go beyond what it is. But if you say, well, it's 20 to 25 years, that's $1 to $1.25 million in water savings by itself. The sunk cost piece is that if you did nothing, you're still going to have to pay almost $1 million to replace the equipment that's there now. So you'll be replacing that equipment and continuing to pay $50,000 a year in water. And then the pros obviously are that newer equipment is more efficient, it's automated, it's easier to work with, it's more cost effective. You can find parts for it. And sometimes you don't know when certain pieces of equipment are not going to have parts anymore. It's just one of those surprises. But I can tell you when you're dealing with a lot of the old equipment that we have, that is something that comes up more often than you'd like. The Lakeview Drive construction, you've heard a bit about this already. So essentially that's relocating some county departments, renovating and upgrading HVAC. There's 2 or 3 projects actually all happening at once in this space. So between that and Lakeview Professional Plaza and a couple smaller pieces, that will then complete the lion's share of the campus. And the county won't really need to be doing much there for 20 to 30 years. There are a couple other bigger pieces that we'll talk about. But it is a continuation of that master project plan for this space. So the request is nearly $5 million now. Some of that's inflation, some of that's, I've got the asterisk there because we have to look at all the other projects, really figure out where they come out at, and then refine the number based on all of those things. Because one project might cover pieces of the other, is what I'm trying to explain. So you don't want to include that in the cost. But roughly, $4.5 to $5 million is what you're looking at there. This one is going to be, I'm sure there'll be some cognitive dissonance around the North Central Healthcare Chilling Tower, but this is a piece of the campus that has not been addressed as part of the overall construction that's been going on there. So the current equipment in there is 1970s era. It's at end of life. It has campus-wide implications because everything else has been modernized, does tie into those. So the current request is just for design. That would be roughly $80,000, but that's going to get you to the schematic, which the total estimated cost would be $1 million. That $1 million is not on the table this year, but I just want to give you a sense of when I know those estimates, I'm going to provide them based on previous conversations so that you can kind of have a ballpark idea of what we're looking at. The Lakeview Professional Plaza elevator, this doesn't have to happen this year, but it's an issue that eventually will need to be addressed because we can't find parts for the elevator any longer. There are alternatives within the building, which is why it's not something that's compliance related. But nevertheless, at some point, we're going to have to pay $350,000 to replace it. Then, with all of the new moves of North Central individuals and county departments, we're going to have wayfinding done on that campus so that people can find out where people are. So based on a couple different estimates we've been working with local vendors on, you're looking at approximately $250,000. I do think that can be done over 1 to 2 years based on available funding, but also kind of truthing out where sign locations work or don't work. So you can put up temporary things and say, are people finding their way to where they need to go, rather than putting up a permanent sign and sinking your money into it and then discovering nobody finds this sign. Facilities and juvenile building envelope. This is something I asked staff to do because we recognize that there were some issues. This is not something that has to happen right away, but it is something that is more of a fundamental take care of your building issue with caulking, tuck pointing, there's seepage, and the longer you let that persist, the more that envelope begins to deteriorate. So the cost to do that is $400,000. Again, identifying it and getting on a plan with a firm number that you can update with a small percentage increase is what we're trying to do there, or we can fund it, to be determined. Then the courthouse east parking lot out here where the sheriff's office parks, that one, looking at replacing the pavement out there. There's a couple other locations that we'd want to look at in the near future too. So for the non-CIP requests, that's the CWA and solid waste. Overall, the approximate number we're looking at is $21.5 million in projects. Now, don't let that number scare you because that number that's just identifying things. So we know we have to go by regulatory compliance. We know we want to focus on end of life. We also know we want to focus on what direction we get from you and the board to help shape what we actually do in 2024. So the request that's there, it will go down. The next time you see this next month, it will be lower than what it is now based on our initial application of those lenses to what we've received. And I also just included the highway projects and the Lakeview campus project just to illustrate that approximately half of the overall CIP project amount is wrapped up in those two areas alone. So those, just to say that those are large chunks, and we wouldn't expect to have, after 2024, you're not going to have $5 million pops in terms of renovating a campus. Now, years down the road, if there's a highway facility entertained or any other thing like that, then yes. But essentially, this is something that we shouldn't see for quite some time based on everything that's been done in the last couple of years and prior to my arrival. So the next steps, I'll meet with Lance and our staff to review the projects, do the project selection, refine it down, have that update and populate the 2024 list in a 5-year plan. Then bring back those ranked projects in August, county board. Then continue budget development, finalize with the budget adoption later in the year. And in the meantime, updating the ARPA projects, potential ARPA projects, or just projects, I guess, in general. But the TRC and sheriff's storage, I said end of September, same with Lakeview. The jail kitchen I put in there just as a reminder because the jails recently, or they're in the process of selecting a vendor to provide the services in the space. So now the next step is get the contract for them in place so we can talk about them publicly, and then have them work with the architect to get that schematic design so that we can bring back the ask through the board and committees for phase 2 or construction of that project, with the goal being completion before the end of the year. And we should have some firm estimates for budget planning by October on that as well. So thank you for listening. I know it was 30 slides of things at the end of your meeting with a closed session on the horizon, but it's hard to get away from a long discussion around CIP.
Thank you. I think it was a very good presentation, and we'll look forward to hearing more. Chair Gibbs.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Chris, for the detail. Several of the, just making a couple of notes myself, there was almost $2 million worth of CIP requests for various parks in the Parks Department. And some of those are enhancing utilizations for individuals. Is there a way that we could, move in a direction that provides, a cost recovery from that department in fees, so that, like you had alluded to a little bit, that a replacement fund be set up so that when we have to do some of the replacing of some of these outdated facilities, we have the dollars to utilize. So if you will, a segregated fund. So if we could find, a way to look at what those fees would be, or potentially have administration look at some kind of a plan to utilize that, I think that would make more sense long-term for the county and the utilizers of those facilities. So I think that's something that I would be interested in seeing.
Yeah, I agree 100%, and I think it would just be getting together with Parks administration, and then even, I know we've alluded to and kind of danced around the topic at this committee before, but then bringing that conversation here and saying, what does a realistic step forward based on that conversation look like? And then if you get into that program, then I think you'd also get some feedback in terms of how those replacement funds develop or returns look, which might further direct how the county decides to invest future funds, so that based on trends that this park is really popular and we invested this and we're seeing this return, versus maybe we put something over here and nobody really goes there.
I would just take that a step farther, and it would be nice if we could recoup these investments, particularly if they're aimed at generating revenue, and treat it more as an enterprise, particularly for those improvements that are aimed at expanding camping and other things. So is there a way for us to look at both the immediate replacement and sort of creating that depreciation account, so that we don't have a capital expense going forward? So I would encourage you to look at that.
If I can add, I think that's a great idea. That was one of the areas of direction we were hoping to get. I think it makes logical sense to do that, and not to foreshadow another conversation that you're going to have. You've already started to have it at various committees. I mean, we have ice facilities at the Marathon County Marathon Park that are in dire need of a lot of essentially ultimately replacement, and that is not going to be a small price tag for that. And we hope we get a lot of outside investment in making that happen, but it behooves us to have a kind of a template to go through to apply there, so that we're not in the same position that, if we as Marathon County would have had this in place in whenever the ice was original in 1980, we would have a fund that we could utilize to replace that. Essentially, you're funding the depreciation of your buildings, which is, I think everyone recognizes that. So I'm glad that you asked that prompting question. We were hoping that was going to come out, so that when we bring our recommendation back, we already know from existing policy, you want us to focus on regulatory issues, end of life, routine maintenance. But this additional idea, as you've had the discussion about return on investment for energy projects, it's pretty clear, at least to me, and I would appreciate if there's some, clear direction in that regard, that, hey, we really should prioritize those projects that have that return on investment, but also prioritize and fund projects, develop a funding strategy for projects that have these revenue options, with one caveat, and that is that we have a process in place to use to borrow Chris's words here, right? The ARPA opportunity, or ARPA opportunity, whatever we're going to call that, to use that initial investment to be that bridge to funding depreciation, so that moving forward, replacement and upkeep is something that we have a strategy that exists outside of CIP, particularly outside of Barnum.
Other questions? Kurt?
Yeah, I think that, it's a great beginning of the discussion, because I think historically we've always done a great job in some cases of taking fees and using them for operations inside a department, but we haven't, as you alluded to, as business does, fund depreciation for replacement at some future point. And so I think we need to have those discussions. We need to have that plan and clearly identify the ability to do that moving forward, especially when we start to look at, some large projects such as the ice arena as we expand facilities. So.
And I think on the other end of that spectrum, we talk about the large projects, but Chris already gave you a great example of kind of the things that have to this point also been under the radar, and that's the small, what I'll call the small stuff, rolling stock.
Yep.
To the extent we are paying, I'll just give you an example. We have some programs, as we talked about, that are 100% cost recovery for, let's just use children's long-term support. If we have people in the children's long-term support program that are then utilizing their personal vehicle, incurring mileage expense that is covered by the program, we front the 65.5 or 66.5, whatever it is, cents. We then get reimbursed. If we had a fleet and use that as an opportunity to charge the fleet, because we know that the operation of the fleet is more than just the enterprise operation of 42 cents, but if it's permittable to charge the fleet operation the 66 cents or 65.5, and we know our operating is 40, we can use that to grow the fleet over time to get people in safer vehicles, more fuel efficient vehicles. And what that does is over time, it might require an initial investment, much like we're talking about with these buildings, an initial larger investment. But over time, your investment, you have that return where you can get people into those more fuel efficient vehicles, safer vehicles. And that allows us to use that rolling stock allocation that's been the same for over 10 years on the other vehicles, the other pieces of equipment that we do have significant need on, which are like the boom trucks in Parks, Rec, and Forestry, the highway plow vehicles, graders, things of that nature. So I think there's a lot of opportunities, but they're all, that consistent thread is, what's the strategy? How do we use this as an investment? So I'm glad we had this conversation.
Yeah, I think, are there any other critical issues? Because we'll see this again next month, and I think we've still got a closed session. Cody?
Not a critical issue, but a request if you could send that presentation to the committee, because I think that's clear and concise information that'll help us make decisions as we move forward. Thank you.
No problem.
Anything else? If not, we're going to jump back up then to item 6A4. Somebody want to read the motion? Chair.
Motion to go into closed session, roll call, vote suggested pursuant to Wisconsin statute 19.85, parent 1, parent E, for the purpose of deliberating or negotiating the purchase of public properties, the investing of public funds, or conducting other specific public business whenever competitive or bargaining reasons require a closed session, to wit, review of appraisals for and discussing the strategy of renovating regarding the potential purchase of private property adjacent to the county-owned properties.
Is there a second? Seconded by Supervisor Leahy. Any discussion? If not, all those in favor will signify by saying aye when their name is called.
Great dodge.
Or is it voting when their name is called?
Robinson.
Aye.
Leahy. Gibbs. Marshall. Hart. Lemmer. Zhang.
Supervisor Zhang indicated that he needed to step away for a few minutes. He may, and he can't. Supervisor Marshall jumped off. Okay. All right, with that.